Welcome to the Teens Talk podcast, created by the Student Virtual Board of Youth Celebrate Diversity. YCD supports teachers and students organizing locally, educating themselves and their peers, and taking action for inclusion and social justice. For more information, please visit ycdiversity.org. Welcome to Season 3 of the Teens Talk podcast. I'm your host, Leila, and my focus this season is on dialogue. Dialogue is the bridge that connects diverse perspectives, fosters understanding, and paves the way for meaningful change. For this episode, I brought together a fantastic group of people who are experts in fostering dialogue. They're here to kick off the season and set an example for this incredible journey ahead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mason Estes. I'm La Jolla Ben Laseño, indigenous people of Southern California, Northern Mexico, but born and raised here in the land of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute, Mountain Ute, the land that we now call the state of Colorado. I am currently serving as the adult mentor for Youth Celebrate Diversity. I'm a coaching role for some of the young people here involved in Youth Celebrate Diversity, the board of about 30-some students who every year put on the Youth Celebrate Diversity Colorado conference. I'm a coach for them. I'm currently a project coordinator at the Native American Rights Fund, an indigenous law firm out of Boulder, Colorado. For them, I'm a project coordinator on the implementation project, a collection of our different attorneys in our collaboration with the CU Law School, where we're supporting different tribal leaders and tribal communities all over the world to have better enhanced participation at the United Nations. But yeah, an indigenous activist, transitioning from more of a youth role at 24 years old, stepping away from more of my youth activism and settling into being more of a supporting role and helping young people find their voice and empowering them in the work that they're all doing. But I'm incredibly honored to be with this amazing group here today and really excited to jump into the conversation. So thank you for having me.
Happy to have you here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rana Razzaque, and I use she, her pronouns. I am originally from Bangladesh and immigrated to the United States when I was 4 years old and lived in Maryland for about a decade. During that time, I started school not speaking any English, so I learned how to speak English in first grade in kindergarten when I started classes here. Moved around schools a lot while I lived in Maryland. And then the summer, right before high school, I moved to Texas, just outside of Austin. Went to high school and college at Texas, go Longhorns, and majored in English literature. And then I did my master's at Arizona State, where I also majored in English literature. I totally thought that I was going to be a literature professor, but had the opportunity to just work with some incredible historically underserved student populations while I was getting my master's in Phoenix, Arizona. And so it really kind of shifted my trajectory, and I ended up working in higher ed for a few years, doing kind of student services type roles. And then I went back to get my doctorate in educational leadership and policy studies and went back to K-12 education so that I could really work with students who, again, were historically underserved earlier on in their educational trajectories. And I really wanted to kind of step outside of just individually offering student supports when students were hurting to thinking about systems and patterns of inequity and addressing kind of some of those root causes that led to this pattern of inequitable outcomes for our historically underserved and marginalized students and families. So I worked in Denver Public Schools for a few years, in Jeffco Public Schools for a few years. I had a little bit more of a mental health oriented role working with Sources of Strength for a few years. And now I have the honor of serving Englewood Schools and our community here as their Director of Opportunity Access and Inclusion.
It's wonderful to be here with all of you. What amazing work everybody is doing. I am an independent documentary filmmaker. I have been doing this for about 15 years. Prior to this, I worked as a union organizer right out of college. So I come to all of my work with a real sense of deep listening and bringing people together toward a similar goals. And so I should back up a minute and say I use she/her pronouns. I was raised in Western Massachusetts, which is the land of the Mohawk people, and I currently live just outside Boston, in what was the land of the Massachusetts people, and not to be confused with the name of the state. Um, the so most of my work is, I would say, the common thread through all of my work is uh, is really marginalized voices. It's not marginalized voices. That's why I hesitated. It's more about stories that have gone untold and that are critical to our understanding of who we are as a people in the United States. Um, that so that I've had different worked on different projects, but that is a common thread that brings them all together. So I'm excited to go deeper as we talk together.
That's really awesome. I'm so honored to have you all here doing so many amazing things. So let's waste no time and dive into the first question. So, what do you all think is just the value in having a dialogue with people who are different than you?
I think humans are hardwired to be collective creatures. Some of us are more introverted, some of us are more extroverted, and want to honor that, but we are meant to live in community with one another. And to have dialogue and discussion is at the core of that. Long before we wrote to express ourselves, we spoke to express ourselves. And oral traditions are such a critical part of so many different Indigenous traditions and the passing down of histories and stories and ancestral wisdom. And so when we think about discussions and dialogue as they're relevant today, it builds our collective wisdom. It shares all of the different responsibilities that we hold to ourselves, to one another. And just thinking about the state of the world today, as a result of historical oppression, as a result of, the COVID pandemic and lockdown, and not really taking time to heal from that, even though lockdown has ended, the racial reckoning that we've had in the United States, and not to mention like global politics. One of the difficulties is creating spaces for people to be able to have hard dialogues and discussions. And by dialogue and discussions, it doesn't mean, an echo chamber. It means kind of grappling with people who think and feel differently, but being able to do it with a sense of dignity and respect and empathy for one another. And so I'll just kind of close with this. My connection with dialogue and discussion is that it sparks communal healing, so that we're not trying to manage all of this alone, and can kind of lean on one another and be better societally because of that.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's amazing. And if I can build on that with one thing that really stuck out was the idea of responsibility, in that we have a responsibility to be able to have these conversations. And the importance, I think, that really arises from these conversations comes from, we've seen what happens when we don't have that level of respect with each other. We've seen what happens when people from different identities, different communities, different backgrounds, when we can't come together and have a respectful dialogue done in that good way, to where we can see each other for the value that we inherently have as human beings. When we lose the ability to communicate with one another, we've seen that at an international scale with the conflicts that are happening around the world. We see that nationally, at a national level, with our political scene. And I think we see it locally in our ability to, you have a conversation with a student or a young person, and they say, I'm worried about the holidays because I have one uncle who has this mindset and one relative who has this mindset. Those are the products of us not feeling comfortable having conversations. Now, and I'm sure we'll go into this later, but talking about the different tools we've used and the different experiences. But I think understanding that value inherently at the very start, to know no matter what this identity is, no matter where this person comes from, they deserve respect and they deserve to have this dialogue. So I think that responsibility and respect piece is huge.
I mean, as human beings, we definitely look for people who are like us, right? We have, because we feel comfortable, and it's a safe space. But the more that we only look for folks who are like us, the less we're going to understand each other. And we're in a dangerous time when not understanding someone else has become acceptable, and that dehumanizes the other people, right? And so I think we need to lean into the idea that if we're not talking to each other as human beings and being willing to share things and feel vulnerable, then we play into the vicious cycle that is dangerous. And I think we're in a moment that it can get very dangerous if we don't encourage other people to continue to have these kinds of brave conversations. I will also add, if I want to pivoting to my work in filmmaking, historically there's this idea that you have this director who's in charge, but the reality is that when ideas are evolved creatively in collaboration, they are the best and the strongest. And so, in my experience, the most magical moments happen when people with very different ideas come together and work through hard creative choices, and then together that comes out with something better. And I think that can be a metaphor for folks of different backgrounds coming together and talking.
Thank you all so much for that. I really loved how you were talking about how this whole bringing ideas together and dialogue and understanding is really positive. It's not really about swinging someone over to make them agree with you or understand you. It's about mutually creating something together. So thank you for that. So going into kind of the next question, which is going to get a bit more personal, I'm going to kind of bounce off each one of you. In what ways has your own background positively influenced your ability or skills in connecting with others? In what ways has it maybe been a bit of a challenge or something you've had to overcome to connect with other people? I saw you nodding, Mason.
Yeah, I'd be happy to start. I think for mine is always really interesting. The more I've explored it, that development of how my culture and how my identity itself is led to the different skills I have now, skills that I'm incredibly grateful for and experiences that I'm really grateful for. But as I reflect on them, I've kind of learned about myself, about how I had to learn really the hard way. For me as an indigenous person growing up in the 21st century, I'm being 24 years old. I was born when, it was kind of we're starting a new century. We're starting this new understanding of how we're going to interact with different people. For me, my family being indigenous, my mom is white, and me being raised white passing, I had to reconcile a lot with this idea of, I understand my indigeneity. My dad has always told me, you are Liseño. You come from these people. You are my son, your grandfather's grandson. And I know all these things about myself. But in conversation, there was a lot of these instances of, well, you don't look as I understand indigenous people are supposed to look. Like the conversation of, you don't look Indian, that, the image that people associate with indigeneity. And from a really young age, I had to ask my family and say, what am I supposed to respond to this? How am I supposed to respond to this? From whether it was peers, my educators, my teachers, coaches, different people that I was interacting with, how was I supposed to explain to them that they're socially constructed and historically built upon understanding of an identity, this super complex thing, where Mason fits into that, and having to kind of navigate those. Of course, over time too, a lot of people not understanding in my own community where my place was. Well, we have this really long legacy of trauma within our communities, and people claiming indigeneity, especially in the last 24 years, people falsely claiming indigeneity. Oh, I'm 132nd Cherokee. And it's built a lot of distrust within our own communities of, who is this person who's claiming an identity that we know is sacred. So I kind of had to learn both tools, the ability to explain not all indigenous people look the same to somebody who thinks we're supposed to look a certain way, and not all indigenous people look the same to people who I would call my relations, I would call my community members and relatives. So over time, I and it was never a very conscious effort. There was never trainings or workshops that I could have taken to learn those conversations. But I'm really hopeful about how the work I do with YCD now, and I mean the different works, Raina, like the workshop that we were a part of in the fall for YCD, that student leader training, that there's different opportunities for people to share different knowledge that maybe wasn't around when I was a young person, that I'm really hopeful, and I'm really glad that I can be a part of this greater movement and this greater effort to equipping students with the tools that they need so that they can engage with their identities and these tougher conversations. So, and Margo, I'll pass it to you.
I love that you're passing it along. I came up, like I mentioned before, as a union organizer, and so I was trained. My first real professional training, aside from working, as a clerk at the pharmacy, was about listening. It was about sitting and listening and deep listening and really understanding where somebody was coming from. And so I think that has prepared me well for this kind of conversation, which is, I think, the original question was. Um, as I've been through multiple, I won't, I won't say how old I am, but I'm a little bit older, and I think that my culture, my people's tendency, and my own tendency to be very I want to say action oriented, but very like to-do list oriented, right? So like things, like what we're taught about productivity. That's very much in my blood and in my DNA in ways that I'm only starting to really recognize. But that sort of, somehow the more hours we're working, the more productive we are, the more value we have. That's been very much a part of, I was raised with it to such an extent that I didn't even know to recognize it until recently. But I think that it's one thing to know to listen, but to be at the same time in this mindset of work, 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 do is a little bit contradictory. So to be completely honest to answering this question, I think that, I've had a both and of being able, knowing what it's like to listen and really absorb what somebody else is saying to me, and also being on a treadmill that I really need to get off of if these conversations are going to be real. And that's not true just in these kinds of conversations, but in my work life and quite frankly, in personal spaces as well. Rana?
Yeah, Raina. And uh, I just, it's such an honor to kind of hear both your stories, Margo and Mason. And thank you, Leila, for kind of bringing us all together. When you asked this question, I really kind of thought about just my cultural experience. At 4 years old, it was a culture shock to move from Bangladesh to the US. And since I started school at 5 years old, there's been kind of this pressure for assimilation. I didn't have the words for it at 5 or even at 15. And hence, Mason, the work that you're doing with our youth leaders is so powerful, because I thought, it was a me thing, not a societal or systemic thing. But, in this process of assimilation and even, growing up, I moved around schools quite a bit. And I realized I developed skills to fit in, yes, but also in doing so, skills to build bridges with other people. And so as I've kind of undergone my own cultural healing and shifting from letting go of the assimilationist tendencies to acculturation and being able to retain who I am in a society that, oftentimes is trying to strip those things from me. I've been able to kind of reconcile what that dialogue and communication with others looks like in a way that's true to my values, but also builds bridges with other people. And, as hard as some experiences from my childhood were, there's a lot of strengths that I can kind of pull out of that I use now in my work with people who are similar to me and different from me. And so it's all kind of these ebbs and flows of life, but it's really interesting to kind of think about how some of my hardships are some of my biggest strengths now. Not to say that I would wish those hardships on anyone, but it's kind of that idea of well, how do I take these really crappy lemons that I've been handed and make something amazing out of it.
That is so beautiful. I love how you all just kind of like it's about understanding who you are and then it's also understanding people, kind of really meeting them where they're at is what I'm getting is to meet at how to kind of build bridges and connections. So going into the next question, what specific elements or things are required to have a successful conversation when we are kind of talking about identity and perspective? What are kind of the ground rules we should have or considerations? And Margo can start first on this.
Raina, thank you for correcting my pronunciation of your name. And I felt like maybe that's a good segue into ground rules, which is one, being humble when corrected and not getting defensive, I think is really important. And I also remembered as I was listening to you both that this is audio only, and I'm not so sure that I've identified that I am a white woman. So, that is relevant because as we're setting ground rules, depending on the space that we're in, we all bring in certain, with our identities, there's certain things that come with us, whether we like it or not. And it comes with us because of culture and because of, the systems that we are all a part of and who has power and privilege in those systems. And so, so listening in a way that's not defensive, being able to take constructive criticism and not take it personally are really important. And I think for these conversations to be successful, there has to be an understanding of respect and a willingness to say brave things that might feel vulnerable. Because if everybody is just being nice, then we're not really getting to know each other. And that can happen in spaces where it's, an understanding that we're coming to the space to do that. But I also think that that can happen in everyday life. And I've had some experiences recently where I've been in spaces with people very different than me. And we're not setting ground rules or coming to have quote unquote brave conversations, but we're just being real with each other. And so I just want to encourage listeners that you can do this in a lot of places in your life. You can do it with your neighbor who is very different with you, just as much as you can have come to an intentional conversation about hard things that, may be similar to listening to this podcast. So I see lots of nodding heads and smiles. Who wants to jump in? Mason.
I was going to say, Raina, do you want me to go? No, it's amazing. And I think that is that really important idea too about these conversations around diversity, identity, these difficult conversations that we have will require different tools depending on the context. I think it's really important and something that the advice that I give to students a lot when they talk about, I had this really impactful situation about 2 years ago where a student was talking about, I don't know how comfortable I feel coming out to my parents as a gay identifying student. And I had to have this conversation and I have to do this and I don't know what to do. And as for myself as a leader, I knew the best advice I can give was to acknowledge that I have so little knowledge on this, that there are certain tools that you need for that very specific conversation that will help you a lot, and tools that I didn't have in that moment. I'm really grateful that that student was able to find those resources in my peers, other people who do this work with young people. But when I walked away from that situation, I realized there are different tools for different situations, that there are certain conversations with, I know that I've engaged in where there are casual conversations with friends. And even when I was in high school and starting some of this work around 2016, the presidential election had just finished. And I realized the conversation that I'm going to have with my friend is going to be very different than maybe work I'm going to be doing with political organizations as an organizer, with my professors when I get to college. And I think one of the most useful tools for me was to really identify the context of the situation, what some of those privileges are that exist within the relationship between you two, and the power dynamics in acknowledging those and finding different tools. And of course, we can talk more about those specific tools as well. But I think kind of confirming and like affirming what ground everyone's standing and the perspectives people are coming from. And that awareness beforehand is super valuable to have.
Yeah, ditto to what both of you have shared. I guess I'm thinking about to step back. I completely agree with Mason that it depends on the context. And I guess I was trying to kind of think about what are some of my non-negotiables, regardless of context, that really would feed into any context. And one, am I staying true to my values? And that is sometimes easier said than done, because in theory, things might seem really cut and dry. But in practice, in the real world, there's a lot of complexities and variables, and it's harder to see your North Star in a stormy sky. And so you have to know where that North Star is with your internal compass. And so knowing my values, knowing and constantly kind of reflecting on, is this aligned with those values? Two, I'd say listening to understand rather than listening to respond. The response can happen, but am I starting at a place where I'm really just trying to hear a person? Because that's what I would want when I'm speaking, regardless of if the person is of a different perspective or the same. And, at the heart of so many conflicts is not so much the disagreement itself, but the lack of just feeling heard within that dialogue or discussion. And also, I'd say, to just kind of stamp, I think where Margo was going as well with what she was sharing, this sense of humility, of, my own cultural humility, my humility as a learner, in all spaces, and my humility that makes me curious when I approach any conversation.
That was also great from you. I really like kind of the, once again, knowing yourself and approaching it, really making other people understood. And I really liked what you said, Margo, about just being real, kind of with yourself and with others, but with the goal really of understanding first and stuff. So kind of moving forward, this kind of feeds into the last question. Is there any specific like strategies or tools, like maybe it's a method or one thing you do when you're about to approach a challenging conversation? And do you maybe have a story or example you'd like to share of a time you've done that? Right now, I'm going to bounce it to you.
You saw me nodding vehemently. So I actually did my dissertation research on the influence of mindfulness on culturally responsive practices for educators. And it was just such an amazing experience to be able to develop and grow my own mindfulness practice. And I won't say that I am yet at a place where I'm practicing mindfulness regularly and proactively and consistently. But I do try, and I think that keeps me at a certain level of openness to be there for myself, to be there for other people. You can't pour out of an empty cup, as they say. But it also, aside from some of those longer term practices like meditation and gratitude practice, and just even, physical exercise that lends itself to mindful practices. I call them kind of pocket practices, the things that I can kind of pull out to help me in a stressful situation. And so I do a lot of training and workshops for folks in my role. And oftentimes I'm going in dealing with my own imposter syndrome or stress that I've had in the morning. I'm not the most calm driver. And so maybe I hit a lot of traffic getting to that training. But I have to, if I'm going to show up wholeheartedly for the people that I am honored to have in this space with me, I need to show up as my full self, which means it doesn't matter if I've had a hard morning, I need to reset. And so things like square breathing helps me with that. That's where you breathe into the count of 4, hold that, inhale to the count of 4, exhale to the count of 4, hold that out breath to the count of 4, and repeat. What's nice about that, I've even done that in the middle of meetings. Nobody knows that I'm doing it. I'm just calmly kind of sitting back, like, ooh, you are hitting a nerve there, but I'm going to practice my square breathing until it's my turn to, kind of share my thoughts on what you just said. But that's really helpful. I think for me, gratitude practice is really helpful. Connection. I mean, I fold in a lot of connection activities and grounding activities into trainings and meetings that I facilitate, not just for other people, but for me. Because when we're constantly transitioning from one strand of thought or one place to another, it helps to just reground and hold space. And it takes time, but it's an investment that pays dividends on the back end.
I can jump in and add to that because a lot of what you said, I would have shared similar tools. But I think that the one that I just want to repeat, I think merits repeating is meditation. And that doesn't have to be something formal, but just taking a couple minutes to reset before entering. So I think the question was about entering these difficult conversations, taking a minute to reset so that we're not bringing baggage from other conversations or from other things. So I think a lot of times when these conversations don't go well, it's because we're bringing things that either from other spaces of our lives or baggage from other things that have happened earlier in the day. And so resetting and just being present to listen to what the other person is telling you, I think is perhaps the crucial tool to having a deep conversation, in addition to really being able to listen to what somebody's saying and not make assumptions about what they intend, which is also all about coming to a space and not bringing your own baggage with you.
Any addition I have is building off separately. Those are amazing perspectives and things admittedly I'm horrible at. I need to get way better at being more mindful when I go into these spaces. Which also, like, Rana, the work you do, like the academic work around that, this is work everyone needs to be reading, because I know I've recently been in conversations where I'm like, we all would be better off with some more mindfulness in this conversation. But in light of the absence of some of my mindfulness, I think what tools I've used a lot in the past, I would add this in the context of once you have done that mindfulness work to begin with, and now you've entered into the space and you're into that conversation, tools that I've often recommended that have helped me a lot in conversations, or I have seen work with a lot of different interactions, whether it's between peers, between intergenerational conversations, or different power dynamics in conversations. If you are participating in a difficult conversation, in a challenging conversation, if you are participating in it, you have the right to express the need for ground rules, norms in that conversation. If they aren't willing to say, like, yeah, let's build some just norms to start as we go through this conversation, then you're well within your right to say, I don't feel safe participating in this conversation. Let's not, to protect our own well-beings. But for some of those tools, some examples of some of those tools, one, I would say how you're going to communicate. I want you to know, like, for example, if I was speaking to somebody, I'd say, I want you to know that I have a little bit longer trains of thought with things. So if you cut me off, it might sound like very incoherent or a little bit choppy, but I need to finish my full thought. And I would appreciate in this conversation if we could let each other finish before we respond. A simple ground rule like that, oftentimes, like when it's with your parents or when it's with your boss or when it's with different power dynamics, getting cut off feels really disempowering. But if you can build that ground rule right at the start and say, let's have something like that. I think also as you go through a conversation, asking for different tools around like vocabulary. Hey, if we're talking and we're going through this conversation and a term comes up, I may ask in response, what is your understanding of that term? What is your understanding of the terms that you're using? Because oftentimes when we go into conversations, if we're coming in with somebody who comes from a different community, a different identity, they might understand things differently than we do. And if you can have a shared vocabulary in a conversation, that's incredibly helpful to better understanding each other. A great example of this was I had a friend of mine when we were talking about, I actually forget whether it was around like community organizing specifically, but I think it had kind of evolved into how we participate in communities. And we were really butting heads on what our role was as young people transitioning into that more adult role. And we kept throwing around different terms. And I was like, what do you think that term means? And it turns out we both had a very different understanding of what the term was. Once we had said, all right, we agree that it means this. Okay, so that's not what we are trying to do. And we found better understanding after, once we realized if words are the tools that we use to build conversation, if we're using the tools differently, our products are going to look really different. So having some of that shared understanding of how we're building the conversation and what tools we're using, I think is really valuable to have when you're going into especially challenging conversations.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mason.
I know I spoke already, but I just have to, I think that's so powerful, Mason, as far as like getting to that, to a shared understanding of what a word means. I have to say, you know, in our current context, when terms like critical race theory are under attack, it's so important to have a clear understanding of what critical race theory means to each individual. Because to me, I have a very academic understanding of what critical race theory is, but that's different than some of the, just to be blunt, propaganda that is shared about to other folks about what critical race theory means. And so if their exposure to that word is what others have said, this is what this term means, it's different than where I'm approaching it from, and they're functioning out of fear, then I don't even have an opportunity to build a bridge and build understanding if I don't first kind of step back and hear what they feel, what they're afraid of, how they're defining this term. We're arguing about apples and oranges versus apples and apples, right? So yeah, just really powerful. And then just thinking about our own assumptions and biases, you know, going into conversations ourselves.
Yeah, that's so many great examples from you all. You all have just given me such a strong foundation for, I think, how I'm going to want to carry out the rest of the season, and kind of just in general, maybe I'm going to make a specific like guideline I'm going to talk with people about, just to make sure that everyone's coming from a shared set of ground rules and feeling safe and comfortable in their conversations. I'm going to base it on what you all have said, because it's so many awesome tools. So yeah, kind of moving on from beyond what you specifically do, kind of to more of the future of the podcast and other things. Did any of you all kind of know of any people, programs, ideas, like other people who are just doing this work really, really well that I should know about, or other people should know about? I'm going to bounce that to Mason.
Happy to start. I was like, keep looking in-house. You celebrate diversity. Greatest organization ever. No, I love YCD, and the people who work there, I think, are some of the most equipped people I've ever had the opportunity to work with. I know an additional organization that I'm insanely proud of is Women from the Mountain. They're an all Indigenous women doing a lot of climate justice work and a lot of social justice work. They're out of Denver, started in Denver. It is a really powerful organization where in their work and their advocacy around climate justice, around social justice, they are very intentionally going to spaces that traditionally they were not going to be invited, where the perspectives of Indigenous women, like women of color specifically, that oftentimes they weren't respected, whether it be in more political settings, whether it be in organizations that maybe they haven't agreed with over time. They're very intentionally and incredibly bravely going in and speaking their truth to power, inspiring me every single day, every time I get the opportunity to talk to them. So Women from the Mountain, an incredible organization that I would always, if I can plug anybody, that's always the group that I always try to. But yeah, that would be definitely it. Margo, do you want to go next?
Sure. I wanted to applaud you, Leila, on bringing me in on this conversation, because I think on the surface, it might not seem that I am part of organizations that do this work, even though I'm really deeply embedded with this type of work within my documentary and film work. And so I would encourage you to think outside, continue to think outside the box the way you did with this group. And in that spirit, because of my work with election officials, I've been in spaces where it's becoming clearer and clearer that the way that our political system works puts us into boxes, and we often are missing the boat on a lot of really valuable conversations that should be happening. And so in particular, I think a lot of working people really are struggling to be seen right now in our country. Folks like, again, of working class doing regular jobs every day and are not recognized and are not seen and are struggling to be seen and have their voices heard. And they're not necessarily going to be part of groups that are organized as groups that are, working on identity issues, but their voices are desperately needed. And so don't know what groups those are, but finding those voices could be really valuable.
I love that, Margo. I think one group that is often, unheard and has just a lot of things kind of done to them is youth in our society. I think there's more and more movement to I don't want to say empower, but to honor the power that youth have. And all of the work that each generation has done in making progress from the past generation. But I'm, thinking about the No Justice, No Peace podcast that students from MLK, Denver Public Schools High School, created. I think it's really powerful in exploring Black identity and equity issues that is created, by students, for students. So that's, I think, a powerful one. I think that, again, want to echo, Mason, just giving a shout out to Youth Celebrate Diversity and all of the incredible, brilliant young people that YCD kind of brings in. But yeah, I'd be curious to kind of look at, almost do an audit of the landscape of podcasts and, other spaces where people are getting their voices heard, and kind of looking at the gaps, whose voices are missing, because silence is a really powerful tool of oppression. And so if we're really trying to kind of shift that status quo, I just love what you shared already, Margo, and couldn't say it better myself, but just kind of want to underline that.
That's awesome. Also a really great segue into kind of a specific question for this podcast and audience. So how do you envision this work being taken to people who are younger, who are youth in high school or college, who may not necessarily have the time or ability to affiliate, but still want to have these conversations? And I think the first person I'm going to bounce it to is Margo.
I am the least connected to youth, so let me bounce it to someone else, and I'm going to think about it. Mason, you're up.
I think that this is the probably biggest challenge that we're facing in the modern day, specifically around we have the understanding that there are incredible people who have a bunch of knowledge that we want to share with as many people as possible. But what tools do we use to do that? There are some tools that are effective but inherently corrosive. I know social media has gotten a bad rap for like the long-term effects of social media on young people's like brain chemistry or body image or ability to socially interact. I know that there's so much stuff there, but for me, I know as a young person transitioning into this different part of my life, I know that where it can be heard is a great place to be. I know that there are a lot of indigenous TikTokers who are sharing the stories of their people. There is a Navajo TikTok channel that teaches Navajo language on TikTok. Like, these are tools where when we repurpose them for empowerment and liberation, they are amazing tools that we can use for young people. So for me, I think in my dream, in the world that I would like to live in, there is a platform where you can share information like this, whether it's TikTok, whether it's Instagram, where young people see people who look like them, who speak their mother languages, and are sharing of like what is happening in your community now, sharing that vital knowledge that inspires them to stand up, claim their voice, and join this movement of we will not go into this future less power with less power than we are currently standing with. That these young people are going to go forward empowered with their voices, with this different information and move forward. So in an ideal world, that's where I'd like it to go. But Rana, we're going to give Margo as much time as possible. Rana, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So I was going to say TikTok, YouTube. That's kind of what the data shows us is, the platforms that young people are engaging with the most. But at the end of the day, I think one of the most powerful ways to get the word out is word of mouth. And so if you have, a few folks who are champions for this, getting them to commit to sharing with their networks, and then getting their networks to commit to sharing with their networks, using whatever platforms, they decide, because then it's truly of the people, and for the people, not to the people. And so I would, challenge us to think about the ways that we can humanize some of those connections and humanize marketing even in some of those ways. I also just am curious about what that looks like, how we can create more of these spaces for dialogue and representation. And I think the more representation that you build on through a platform like this, the more people see themselves in these conversations, the more they're going to be drawn to it. And at the same time, the push, as I think Margo had talked about way earlier in our conversation, is getting beyond just what we see similar in each other, but once you kind of have everybody at the table, then challenging folks to think a little bit differently, or at least be open to hearing others who think differently. And that's how you kind of widen your net.
Thank you both for giving me some time. I will add on that TikTok and YouTube is where my kids spend most of their time. So that is absolutely the space to be engaging. I would challenge us to find ways to engage with shorter content than, for example, this podcast, because I think that the shorter content is more engaging. I agree, actually. It's more, you have to actually dedicate some time to listen to longer content. But I would add that older folks, and that can be defined in any way, maybe anytime you're older than the person you're with, to pause and take time to listen and engage in conversation with the person. So if you are an older person in a conversation and there is a youth with you, instead of just moving on to the next thing with the understanding that that person who is younger maybe should follow your lead, maybe pause, find out what's going on in their life, ask a question that opens up a conversation. Show some leadership in starting these conversations in whatever spaces we're in. Sort of showing by example, leading by example, I think can be quite powerful.
Thank you all so much for that. And I know next time when I'm saying bouncing stuff around, I'm kind of inviting everyone to speak, so don't feel pressured to share. So our time, sadly, is kind of coming to a close right now. So I had one final closing question for you all, and it's kind of a very personal one. Is there any specific dialogue or conversation that has ever just profoundly altered your perspective or made you who you are today?
I'm happy to jump in with that one. There have been many throughout the course of my life, let me say. But the one that, I guess popped up in my mind right now for whatever reason, and feel called to share that, is when I was starting my doctoral program at the University of Denver, one of their requirements was, and maybe still is, to take this assessment called the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory. And it was a the most powerful test I've ever taken. It was about, maybe 30 minutes to take the test. And it came back with, it gives you kind of these two scores of where you fall along this continuum of intercultural competency. One score is how you perceive yourself. And then the other score is how other people experience you. So it kind of measures that intent versus impact gap. And you don't just get your results. A coach kind of debriefs the results with you. And I got to tell you, when I looked at my results of, really comparing where I thought I was aspirationally to, the way that folks might have been experiencing me. I went through all of the 7 stages of grief. I mean, I was in denial for a while of, no, I wasn't in the right headspace when I took it, to anger of, they don't know me, to just pure, weeping during the debrief. Not my best moment, but now where the person who debriefed me, Dr. Ellen Miller Brown, is one of my just biggest mentors and friends, because we developed a relationship through that. I am so grateful for having that check-in, that opportunity to dig into my own humility, my own curiosity, my own self-reflection, and think about how that's translating, how I'm translating my values into my actions or not, how I might be perpetuating some of the same cycles of oppression that were instilled in me from a very young age without even knowing it, right? Just because I hold various marginalized identities doesn't mean that I am immune to or absolved from those same forms of oppression myself, because I've internalize those messages. It takes a lot of healing and self-work to kind of decolonize and heal ourselves. So that conversation with Ellen was life-changing for me. It really shifted not necessarily the what of what I do, but absolutely shifted how I do what I do, in relationship with others, but also in relationship with myself.
Thank you for sharing. I can I similarly, there's so many. I've had so many of these moments in my life. We could be talking all night. But the one that is popping, that's rising up for me, is a conversation. It was really a panel, more than a conversation. I am an adoptive parent. I have 2 children. One was born to me, and one is adopted. And many years ago, when my adopted child was, I forget how old he was, but under age 10. I went to a panel to listen to birth mothers talk about their experiences, and it wasn't my child's birth mother; it was other birth mothers. But the stories that they were sharing really turned my understanding of the relationship between adoptive parent and birth parent and adopted child upside down in a way that I think changed me on a cellular level. I think for my own personal reasons, hadn't really engaged in deep listening strategies with that particular element of this triad. And so, my understanding of what it is like to be in a position to have to relinquish a child for adoption, or choose, I say in quotations, to place a child for adoption, because most of the time it's not really a choice. My understanding was just turned upside down, and my entire understanding of myself was turned upside down, and what my position is as an adoptive mother. And so I think the takeaway here, maybe for folks who aren't in an adoptive family or a family with adopted members, is that sometimes we forget to pause and really listen to other people, even if they might be very close to us. And in this case, it wasn't my child's birth mother who was talking. It was somebody else with similar experiences. But we can't always assume that everyone has the same experiences, but we can understand that people with similar lived experience might have a similar lived experience, right? And so there are lots of spaces in our lives where we need to be listening, I think might be the takeaway. But that's the story I would share.
Both of those are so incredible. And I think the ways they impact people relationally, how they, with those different relationships and how important those are. I think that the conversation that probably most impacted me allowed for me later in life to be better about being aware of those relations and the relationships I have with others. For mine, it was actually very early in my life. I think I was in 4th grade. So I was baby Mason. I was little Mace. I was about 4th grade, and I had a incident at school. We were doing Colorado history like week at our school, and we were discussing Colorado history and all this stuff. And there was an incident that happened on the playground around cowboys and Indians that we were very on topic for the day on the playground, and decided that cowboys and Indians would have been a great, related topic. Of course, it's 4th graders. It was no one's fault, but I actually didn't understand about how like the political incorrectness and like how problematic that game was. All I knew was that as I knew I was indigenous, I knew I was native, so I wanted to be on the Indians team. And my peers proceeded to explain to me how I don't have long hair, I do not have dark skin, I do not look Indian, thus I am not. And I had this 4th grade identity crisis around who am I? Am I really indigenous? And I had this horrible moment where when I went home at the end of the day, I was like looking at the photos on the wall. I was looking at my older brother who has darker skin than me. I was looking at pictures of my dad, and I had this moment where I said, I'm not indigenous, I'm not native, I'm not my father's son. And I had that heartbreaking moment right as my dad was coming home from work. My dad is a gym teacher at Broomfield High School. Shout out Broomfield, go Eagles. My dad had just gotten home from work and came in and he found me crying. And he got down on a knee and he put his hand on my shoulder. He's like, Mace, what's wrong? And I explained the whole situation, that I'm not native, I'm not all these things. And I broke down crying and goes, oh, Mace, of course you're native. Of course you're listening. You're my son, you're my baby boy. You're the grandson of your father. You are the great-great-grandson of Antonio Guerra Cabal, one of our tribal leaders. You are your ancestors' dream. You are so important and so powerful. Of course you're native. Never listen to those words. You know who you are. Be that person. Then carry your ancestors with you, that identity you have. Carry that with you for the rest of your life. And when I left that conversation, I thought of it almost constantly when I started to get involved in civil rights work, into some of these more difficult conversations, because I realized no matter what happens here, no matter if they agree with me, don't agree with me, if this whole thing falls apart, this whole conversation, and it all goes bad, I know who I am. They can never change me, and they can never change that valuable thing that I have. I'll always carry that with me. They can't take that from me. That understanding of who I am let me fly in these conversations, allowed me to show up as my authentic self and my best self. And I gotta imagine that, someday if I'm a father, what a hard conversation that would be to have with my child. So that was a really challenging conversation, perhaps not for me, but one that altered the trajectory of my life, absolutely made me the person I am today. So.
Thank you to you all for just trusting me with your stories and for sharing all these powerful insights and for being so vulnerable to everyone. This brings our official time to the close. I just want to thank you all. I'm so honored to have such a great group here. That's so much wisdom, so much insight. We could talk all day. And just thank you all so much for your time.